Consider this question for a moment. If modern humans exercise more than any previous generation in recorded history, if we have gyms on every corner, fitness apps tracking every step, and an entire industry devoted to getting us moving, why are our skeletons becoming structurally weaker with every passing decade? That is not a provocative opinion. That is what the fossil record and contemporary skeletal science are telling us. Research comparing bone density and cortical thickness between contemporary adults and pre-industrial human remains consistently reveals that our ancestors had denser, more mechanically robust skeletons, not because they exercised, but because of how they moved. Here is the number that stops most people. Studies of modern sedentary adults show cortical bone thickness between 15 and 20% thinner than comparable skeletal remains from populations living just a few centuries ago. We live longer. We have better nutrition on paper. We have exercise science. And yet our bones are becoming more fragile. Something is wrong with the way we understand exercise. And the deeper issue is not that we exercise too little. The deeper issue is that the kind of exercise most of us do, scheduled, intense, gym-based, structurally repetitive, does not resemble anything the human body evolved to respond to. We are solving the wrong problem, and in doing so, we are making ourselves weaker in ways we cannot see until it is too late. I am Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I have spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now I am here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world, and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to the evolution. If this kind of evolutionary science interests you, the work we discuss in each video goes much deeper in the research. Subscribing means you will never miss a piece of this conversation. And hold that question about our weakening skeletons. We are going to answer it fully, but to answer it honestly, we have to go back, much further back than most fitness conversations are willing to go. There is a property of bone that most people never learn in school, and it changes everything about how we should understand exercise. Bone is not passive scaffolding. It is a living, continuously remodeling tissue that responds directly to mechanical signals, specifically to the forces generated by movement, loading, and strain. This process is governed by what biologists call mechanotransduction. When physical force is applied to bone, specialized cells called osteocytes detect the deformation and trigger a cascade of cellular responses. Bone-building cells, osteoblasts, are recruited to add new material in the directions where load is greatest. Bone-resorbing cells, osteoclasts, remove material where strain is absent. The skeleton is, in a very precise sense, a structure that sculpts itself around the forces it experiences. This is not a modern discovery. Julius Wolff, a German anatomist working in the 19th century, described the principle that bone adapts its architecture to the loads it routinely bears. What we now understand far more deeply is the richness and specificity of those signals. Bone responds not just to load magnitude, but to load variety, load direction, and the rate at which novel loading patterns are introduced. Our ancestors, both deep ancestral populations living several 100,000 years ago and more recent pre-industrial communities, generated an extraordinary variety of mechanical signals every single day without ever stepping into a fitness facility. Consider what daily life actually involved. Carrying uneven loads across uneven terrain, climbing, crouching, squatting, twisting, balancing, reaching, digging, lifting, and sitting on the ground in complex postural positions for hours at a time. Walking for extended periods not on flat, shock-absorbing surfaces, but on varied ground that required continuous micro-adjustments in gait. Processing food and materials by hand, which applied sustained mechanical force through the fingers, wrists, forearms, and shoulders repeatedly throughout the day. None of this was exercise. None of it was performed for health. It was the structural texture of daily existence, and it produced skeletons of remarkable mechanical robustness. When paleoanthropologists examine skeletal remains from populations that live by foraging or small-scale agriculture, we consistently find evidence of what the field calls high habitual mechanical loading. Thick cortical walls, dense trabecular architecture, pronounced muscle attachment sites that reflect sustained, varied use, bones shaped by a lifetime of mechanical conversation with the physical world. And this is where things change. The mechanical variety our ancestors experienced was not incidental. It was the very signal the skeleton evolved to receive. Natural selection, operating across millions of years, built a system that expects diversity of loading as its baseline input. The human skeleton did not evolve to respond to 45 minutes of treadmill running 3 times per week. It evolved to respond to an entire day of physical variety repeated across a lifetime, beginning in early childhood. There is a critical developmental window here that deserves particular attention. The first 2 decades of life are when the skeleton builds its foundational architecture. Peak bone mass, which is the ceiling of structural density a person ever achieves, is largely set before the age of 30. What happens during childhood and adolescence in terms of mechanical loading does not just shape the skeleton for youth. It determines the structural reserve a person carries into midlife and old age. A child who spends 10 years climbing trees, running barefoot on irregular surfaces, carrying younger siblings, digging in the earth, and sitting in complex positions on the ground is not just playing. That child is having an architectural conversation with their own skeleton. The bones are listening, and they are building. Now consider what the evolutionary biology of bone development means for a generation of children who spend the majority of their waking hours seated in chairs, walking primarily on flat surfaces, and interacting with the physical world through fingertip gestures on glass screens. That conversation is not happening, and the skeleton is not building. Somewhere in the development of modern fitness culture, a category error became so widespread that it hardened into accepted wisdom. The error is this: the belief that exercise, defined as structured, intense, scheduled physical activity performed to generate health benefits, is equivalent to the mechanical environment the human body actually evolved to require. These are not the same thing. They're not even close to the same thing. Modern structured exercise is largely characterized by repetition of a narrow movement pattern at high intensity for a compressed period of time, followed by prolonged physical inactivity. A person might run 5 kilometers on a treadmill, performing the same cyclical motion across the same flat surface at a consistent pace for 30 minutes, and then spend the following 16 waking hours seated in a chair. By conventional fitness metrics, that person exercised. By evolutionary metrics, their skeleton experienced a brief burst of mechanically repetitive loading followed by almost no loading at all. The bone does not simply accumulate the benefits of that 30-minute session and hold them indefinitely. The biology of mechanotransduction requires ongoing distributed loading signals across the day to maintain and build skeletal architecture. Intensity is not the primary variable. Variety and temporal distribution are. Think about a retired structural engineer named Margaret, 63 years old, who spent her career at a desk, but has maintained what most people would call a solid fitness routine. Gym sessions 3 mornings per week, focusing on cardio and some resistance machines. Her cardiovascular markers are good, her doctor is satisfied. But Margaret has been experiencing stress fractures in her feet and complains that her wrists feel structurally fragile in ways they never did when she was younger. What Margaret's exercise routine has done well is improve cardiorespiratory function. What it has failed to do is provide the skeletal diversity of loading her bones evolved to maintain their architecture. The machines she uses constrain movement through fixed planes. Her treadmill work generates repetitive, identical impact on the same surfaces. Her hands and wrists, which our ancestors used with enormous mechanical intensity throughout every day, are barely loaded at all. Margaret is not a failure of motivation. She is a product of a mismatch between what modern exercise culture tells us we need and what evolutionary biology actually requires. And this creates a problem no one anticipated. As populations have shifted toward more structured exercise and away from habitual physical variety, we have created what skeletal researchers call a bifurcated mechanical environment. A small portion of the body, whichever muscle groups the chosen exercise targets, receives concentrated loading. The vast remainder of the musculoskeletal system receives almost none. The result is not general skeletal health. The result is pockets of relative robustness, surrounded by regions of structural neglect. There's a broader cultural dimension to this mismatch that also matters. The modernization of environments, smooth floors, elevators, chairs at precisely table height, shoes designed to absorb and redirect ground reaction forces, tools designed to minimize grip force requirements, has systematically removed low-level mechanical diversity from daily life. Each individual convenience is sensible. Collectively, they have created a physical world that whispers almost nothing to the human skeleton. We solved the problem of physical hardship, and in doing so, we accidentally solved away the mechanical conversation our bones depend on. There is another dimension of this that rarely enters fitness conversations. Modern footwear design has systematically removed one of the most important sources of skeletal loading from the entire lower limb. The human foot contains 26 bones and 33 joints. This extraordinary architectural complexity did not evolve so that we could place it inside a rigid foam cradle that absorbs and redirects force before the skeleton can register it. It evolved to transmit and distribute ground reaction forces in ways that generate loading signals across the entire lower kinetic chain, from the toes through the foot arch, ankle, tibia, femur, and pelvis. When we cushion and constrain that system, we do not protect the skeleton from stress. We deprive it of the mechanical information it evolved to receive. The micro-loading events that would, across a lifetime of walking, contribute to cortical bone maintenance in the foot, ankle, and lower leg are muffled before they can register. It is another form of silence in a skeleton that evolved to hear, but there is a deeper layer to this mismatch, one that took researchers much longer to understand. And it involves not just what adults do, but what happens, or fails to happen, at the very beginning of skeletal development. Let's step back for a moment. If you remember nothing else, remember this: the human body does not become structurally stronger from exercising more. It becomes structurally stronger from experiencing diverse, distributed, habitual mechanical loading across the entire body, beginning in developmental childhood and continuing without interruption across the lifespan. Exercise, as we have defined it, can be part of that, but it is not sufficient on its own. And for most people, it is not even addressing the right problem. This is the exercise myth. Not that exercise is useless, it is not. The myth is that structured exercise, performed with sufficient intensity and frequency, substitutes for the full mechanical diversity the human skeleton evolved to require. It does not. Let me give you the most compelling piece of evidence for this claim. It comes from a research domain called bioarchaeology. The study of human skeletal remains in archaeological context. When researchers compare the skeletal robusticity of populations from different historical periods, a consistent pattern emerges. Populations that transitioned from physically active subsistence lifestyles to more sedentary agricultural or urban lifestyles show a measurable decline in skeletal robusticity within just a few generations. This transition is visible in bone cross-sectional geometry, in the reduction of pronounced muscle attachment sites, and in the thinning of cortical bone walls. The reversal happens remarkably fast in evolutionary terms. What took millions of years to build begins to change within decades of lifestyle shift. The skeleton responds to absence of loading with the same efficiency it responds to its presence. Remove the signal, and the architecture quietly retreats. Here is where the counterintuitive insight becomes precise. Researchers studying the biomechanics of habitual movement versus structured exercise have identified something that the fitness industry has largely failed to absorb: the skeletal loading generated by sustained, low-intensity mechanical variety, carrying objects in varied configurations, walking across irregular surfaces, assuming and rising from ground-level positions, performing manual tasks that load the hands and upper body repeatedly, produces bone adaptation signals that are different in character from those produced by structured exercise. It is not simply a matter of total load volume. It is about the diversity of strain directions, the novelty of loading patterns, and the temporal distribution of mechanical signals across the waking day. Bone cells, it turns out, become temporarily desensitized to repeated identical loading signals, apply the same mechanical force in the same direction repeatedly, and osteocytes reduce their response. This is called mechanosensory adaptation. It is why long-distance runners who train on flat surfaces do not necessarily have unusually dense leg bones. The skeleton becomes habituated to that specific repetitive signal, but introduce a novel strain direction, a different movement pattern, a different direction of force, a different surface, and the skeletal response reactivates. The osteocytes respond as though encountering a genuinely new stimulus. Your body is not failing. It is responding exactly as it evolved to. The problem is not that your biology is broken. The problem is that the mechanical environment we have built around ourselves does not speak the language your skeleton was designed to hear. And this leads to a surprising realization. The exercise myth is not just making us weaker structurally. It is creating a specific kind of invisible vulnerability that accumulates slowly and reveals itself at the worst possible moment, typically in midlife or later adulthood, when the baseline mechanical environment has been insufficient for decades and the skeleton's capacity to respond to even adequate loading has diminished. Osteoporosis is not primarily a calcium deficiency disease. It is fundamentally a mechanical neglect disease. The The skeleton did not receive the signals it needed to maintain its architecture, and the structural deficit accumulated invisibly over years. By the time it becomes a clinical diagnosis, the deficit represents decades of insufficient mechanical conversation. This is worth sitting with, because it means that the solution to skeletal vulnerability is not simply more exercise. It is different movement that provides variety, distribution, novelty, and continuity across the entire waking day. There is also a dimension of this story that involves connective tissue, tendons, ligaments, and fascial networks that follows the same evolutionary logic but operates on a different timescale. Tendons are mechanically adaptive structures that thicken, stiffen, and store elastic energy in response to appropriate loading, but they adapt significantly more slowly than muscle. A structured exercise program that loads muscle rapidly can create a mismatch between muscle capacity and tendon strength, which is one reason tendon injuries are so prevalent in populations that exercise intensely after periods of inactivity. There is a useful analogy here that helps clarify why this matters practically. Imagine a language that your body speaks fluently at birth, one it was shaped over millions of years to use. That language is mechanical loading. It has a large vocabulary: impact, tension, compression, torsion, shear, sustained grip, axial load, lateral force. The skeleton interprets each of these as distinct signals, and it responds to sentences composed of varied terms with far greater architectural investment than it responds to the same word repeated thousands of times. Modern exercise, in its most common forms, is like speaking a single word of that language with great enthusiasm for 30 minutes and then remaining silent for the rest of the day. The skeleton hears the repetition. It responds modestly to the familiar signal, but it never receives the full conversation it evolved to build from. And there is a broader implication here for how we think about the aging body. Age-related skeletal fragility, the thinning bones, the increased fracture risk, the gradual structural retreat that characterizes later life for many people in industrialized societies is often framed as an inevitable biological consequence of aging, as though the skeleton simply deteriorates on schedule regardless of what we do. But comparative studies of physically active older populations and archaeological populations that maintained physically engaged lifestyles into old age consistently challenge this assumption. The rate of skeletal decline is not fixed. It is substantially modifiable by the mechanical environment. Populations that maintain diverse habitual mechanical loading across the lifespan show dramatically better skeletal preservation into advanced age than those whose mechanical environment becomes impoverished in midlife. Your instincts evolved for a different world, but the skeletal biology itself has not changed. The capacity to respond to mechanical signals, to rebuild, to adapt, it remains active across the entire human lifespan. What is required is providing it with the signals it is waiting for. The evolutionary evidence, taken seriously, points toward a reframe that is less about exercise frequency and more about the texture of the physical day. This is not a rejection of structured exercise. Cardiovascular training, resistance training, and deliberate physical practice all have genuine value, but they need to be understood for what they are: powerful but incomplete tools that address specific physiological goals. They are not substitutes for the mechanical variety the entire musculoskeletal system requires. What the evolutionary biology of skeletal adaptation actually suggests is this: the most important structural variable for lifelong musculoskeletal health is not peak exercise intensity. It is the breadth and continuity of mechanical loading across the waking day, across varied movement patterns, beginning as early in life as possible and sustained without prolonged interruption. This requires a different kind of attention than most fitness conversations invite. Rather than asking how long your workout was, the evolutionary question is, how mechanically diverse was your day? Did your skeleton receive loading signals from multiple directions? Did your hands and forearms bear any meaningful force? Did you carry anything? Did you sit on the ground and rise from it? Did you walk on surfaces that required active balance adjustments? Did your hips, knees, and ankles move through a variety of positions or through the same repetitive cycle? For many adults in sedentary work environments, these questions reveal a significant gap between exercise effort and mechanical sufficiency. Consider a person named James, 51 years old, a project manager who runs 4 days per week and considers himself fit. James's cardiovascular health is genuinely good, but his daily life involves 10 or more hours of seated work, walking exclusively on flat surfaces, carrying almost nothing heavier than a laptop bag, and using tools that require minimal grip force. His skeleton, despite his running, is experiencing something close to mechanical poverty in large regions of the musculoskeletal system. The evolutionary reframe for James is not to run more. It is to restructure his physical environment to create more distributed mechanical diversity across his day, not as additional exercise sessions, but as a redesign of the physical texture of his existing time. This aligns with what researchers have called the concept of non-exercise physical activity, all the movement that occurs outside of deliberate exercise sessions. Studies comparing populations with high levels of non-exercise physical activity to those with equivalent total exercise but greater sedentary time consistently show better skeletal outcomes in the former group. The mechanical signals are more distributed, more varied, and more continuous. What feels like a weakness or inconvenience in modern life, like carrying groceries, using stairs, sitting on the floor, preparing food by hand, walking across uneven ground, is actually the delivery mechanism for signals the skeleton evolved to receive. These are not hardships to be optimized away. They are, from an evolutionary standpoint, the conversation your bones are designed to have. This response makes evolutionary sense. There's also a specific implication for the way we think about the physical lives of children and adolescents. If peak bone mass is substantially determined by the mechanical loading experienced in the first 2 decades of life, then the physical impoverishment of modern childhood, reduced unstructured outdoor play, highly cushioned footwear, pervasive seating, and the replacement of varied physical engagement with screen interaction, has structural consequences that extend far beyond childhood itself. The skeletal ceiling that a child fails to build is not recoverable in the same way later in life. What is not built during the developmental window that nature allocated for this purpose represents a permanent structural shortfall, not a catastrophe for everyone, but a baseline that requires more deliberate compensatory effort to maintain in the decades that follow. This is one of the more sobering implications of the evolutionary evidence. The individual most at risk from the modern exercise myth is not the sedentary adult who never exercises. It is the person who exercises diligently in a narrow pattern, perceives themselves as physically active and healthy, and remains entirely unaware that large regions of their musculoskeletal system have been in a state of chronic mechanical underfunding for years. What feels like weakness is often ancient design meeting an inadequate environment. The design is sound, the environment is the problem. We began with a question that most fitness conversations never ask. If modern humans exercise more than any previous generation in recorded history, why are our skeletons becoming structurally weaker? The answer, as the evolutionary biology makes clear, is that we have been confusing exercise with the mechanical environment. We have optimized for cardiorespiratory performance, for muscle hypertrophy, for metabolic output, all genuinely valuable goals, while leaving the foundational architectural language of the skeleton almost entirely unaddressed. The skeleton does not care whether a movement was intentional. It does not register effort or motivation. It responds to mechanical reality, to force, direction, variety, novelty, and temporal distribution. And when those signals are absent, the architecture that took millions of years to design quietly and efficiently dismantles itself. The fitness industry is extraordinarily good at motivating people to exercise. What it has been far less good at is communicating what kind of movement the human body actually evolved to need and what happens structurally when that need is met only partially. There is a profound irony at the center of modern physical culture. We have built an entire infrastructure of exercise to compensate for the mechanical poverty of modern life. And yet, the exercise we have built largely recreates the same mechanical poverty it was designed to remedy: concentrated, repetitive, brief, and surrounded by hours of physical stillness. Your body is not failing you. It is responding faithfully and precisely to the environment you are giving it. The ancient biology that shaped your skeleton over millions of years is still present, still listening, still ready to adapt. It simply needs to be spoken to in the